The Gilded Consort, Chapter 1, The Recommendation Nobody Ever Chose Me Twice. That was the one fact of my childhood I never had to relearn, because it never once gave me the chance to forget it. An orphanage that fed 40 children on a budget meant for 30. A string of foster placements that lasted exactly as long as the stipend did, and not one day longer. By the time I was old enough to understand what was happening to me, I had already stopped waiting to be wanted. I had started instead to calculate. Money means freedom. That was the whole of my philosophy by 16, and nothing that happened afterward ever complicated it. I didn't want a soulmate. I didn't lie awake wanting someone to heal whatever the moving boxes and the borrowed beds had done to me. I wanted a life large enough and locked enough that no one could ever again stand in a doorway and tell me I had nowhere else to go. I was 22 when a former assistant of Adrian Vale's, a tired, kind woman named Miss Reyes, who was leaving the position to have her first child, recommended me for the job. She'd worked with me for a season at a smaller firm and told anyone who'd listen that I was the most competent person she'd ever trained. I didn't correct her. I simply made sure, every day of that season, that the compliment would eventually be worth repeating. The interview took 11 minutes. Adrian Vale did not look up from his tablet for the first 4 of them. "You're smaller than I expected," he said finally, glancing over, not unkind. Simply an observation, delivered the way he delivered everything, flat, assessing entirely without warmth. "I've been told that before, sir," I said, and let my voice go soft and slightly uncertain, the exact register of a person still nervous in an unfamiliar room. I wasn't nervous. I have not been nervous in a very long time. But looking uncertain in front of powerful men has always gotten me further than looking capable, at least until they've already decided to keep me. He hired me on the spot. I don't think it was my qualifications, though those were genuinely spotless. I think it was the particular quality of my stillness in that chair, the kind of stillness that makes a man who is used to noise notice, for the first time in a long while, how quiet a room can be. I didn't walk into Vale Group with a plan to destroy anyone's marriage. I want that understood from the very beginning, because I intend to be honest with you the whole way through this account, even in the places that reflect badly on me. I took the position because it paid extraordinarily well, and because Miss Reyes had described Adrian Vale as difficult but fair. And difficult but fair has always been, for me, a perfectly acceptable trade. I remember the drive home that first night more clearly than almost anything else from that entire year. Sitting in the back of a hired car I could finally afford without flinching at the fare. Looking out at a city I had spent my whole life watching from the outside of. And thinking, with a calm I'd worked 22 years to earn, that this was the closest I had ever come to feeling something like arrival. Not happiness exactly, something steadier than that. The particular quiet of a person who has just secured one more inch of ground that no one can take back from him. I only started paying closer attention once I understood what kind of man I was actually working for. Chapter 2. What I noticed Adrian Vale was 31, colder than any man I had worked for, and I came to realize within the first month, almost entirely alone. He was married. His wife, Vivienne, called the office 2 or 3 times a day, always about something that could have waited, always in a voice that assumed the answer would bend around her. He had a 6-year-old daughter, Ari, whom he loved with a plain, uncomplicated devotion that surprised me the first time I saw it. A man that controlled in every other room of his life. Kneeling on an office floor at 8 in the evening to help a child glue sequins onto a paper crown for a school project he'd nearly missed. I noticed that his marriage functioned like a transaction neither party had ever renegotiated since the day it was signed. I noticed that he was attentive to Vivienne in exactly the ways a dutiful husband is documented as being: anniversaries remembered, gifts sent, appearances made, and utterly absent in every way that isn't documented at all. I noticed within 6 weeks that he had started glancing at me slightly longer than a man glances at furniture. I did not manufacture that attraction. I want to be precise about the order of events, because I think the order matters more than people assume. Adrian noticed me first. I only, afterward, decided not to discourage it. I brought him the specific brand of black coffee he liked without being told twice. I learned that he preferred silence over small talk during long nights, and gave him exactly that: companionable, undemanding silence, the kind that asks nothing of him, and yet somehow makes an empty office feel less empty. I remembered that his daughter was afraid of thunderstorms, and that he never quite knew what to say to calm her down over the phone during his travel weeks. And one evening, without being asked, I simply took the phone from him and told her a story until she stopped crying and started laughing instead. He watched me do that with an expression I hadn't yet learned to read on him. I understand it now. It was the exact moment a lonely, controlling man realized that someone had reached a part of his life he'd never managed to reach himself. I did nothing so unsubtle as flirt. I have never needed to. I only ever needed to be reliably, quietly present in the specific places his own wife had stopped bothering to occupy. Chapter 3. What the office thought of me. I want to tell you something about the version of me that existed at work, separate from anything to do with Adrian, because I think it matters that my position there was never built on his interest alone. Within 3 months, I had become, by simple reputation, one of the most trusted people in that building, not because I was the CEO's beautiful assistant, though I certainly was that too, but because I was frighteningly, consistently good at the job itself. I remembered the receptionist's daughter's recital date and asked about it every single time without fail. I noticed when the junior analyst 2 floors down was quietly struggling with a project and helped her past it without ever making her feel managed. I brought small, thoughtful things to people on forgettable Tuesdays. A coffee, a pastry, a note, not because I calculated a return on each one, though I understood perfectly well that kindness compounds, but because I have always genuinely enjoyed being the kind of person a room is glad to have in it. By the 6th month, people didn't say the CEO's assistant when they met me. They said, "Ask Sielle, he'll actually fix it," and handed me problems that had nothing to do with Adrian at all. That reputation mattered more than anyone ever realized. Later, when they tried to reduce everything I'd built to nothing more than a beautiful face in the right man's lap. Long before Adrian ever looked at me twice, an entire floor of people who owed me nothing had already decided, on the evidence of my actual work, that I was worth keeping. Chapter 4. Vivienne. I met Adrian Vale properly at a company gala in my 2nd month, and I understood everything about her within the first 90 seconds. She was 28, beautiful in the loud, curated way of someone who has spent her entire life being told her beauty was an achievement rather than an accident. And she looked at me the way she looked at anything new in a room she considered hers, assessing, faintly territorial, already bored. "You're the new assistant," she said, not a question, looking me over once, top to bottom, the exact appraisal of someone deciding whether an object was worth being jealous of. "I go by Sielle, Mrs. Vale. It's an honor to meet you." I bowed the correct amount, soft-spoken, eyes down just enough to read as deferential rather than furtive. She didn't answer. She turned to Adrian instead and said, in the specific tone of someone continuing an argument that had started before I arrived, "You said you'd be done by 8. It's 8:40. Something came up. Something always comes up." She said it lightly, the way people say true things they've decided to treat as jokes so they don't have to feel them fully. Then she looked at me again, quick, assessing, and something in her face tightened. Not suspicion yet. Nothing so specific, only the faint, animal recognition of a woman noticing, for the first time, that a new and very beautiful thing had entered a room she thought she controlled completely. I want to be honest, I felt nothing sharp toward her that night. No hatred, no plan. I only understood, watching her demand her husband's attention in front of his staff at his own company gala, exactly what kind of woman I was dealing with, someone who had never once had to earn anything she considered hers, and who therefore had no idea how to keep it once someone else started quietly, patiently outworking her for it. She cornered me near the coat check before the night ended, without Adrian nearby to overhear it. "A word of advice," she said, smiling in the specific way people smile when they intend the opposite of kindness. "Don't get comfortable. Assistants come and go around here. I've outlasted 4 of them already." I thanked her for the advice, softly, gratefully, and watched something in her expression falter slightly at getting no fight to push against at all. I have never once needed to fight the people I intend to outlast. Fighting only teaches them where you're vulnerable. Stillness teaches them nothing and costs me nothing to give. Chapter 5. Ari. I met Ari 2 weeks later. On a Saturday Adrian hadn't meant for me to work, called in because a deal was collapsing and he needed documents pulled from the house office. She was 6, small, sharp-eyed in the specific way lonely children often are, sitting alone on the stairs of that enormous house with a book she wasn't really reading. "Are you Daddy's new person?" she asked, watching me with the frank suspicion children reserve for anyone who might be temporary. "I suppose I am," I said, and sat down 2 steps below her, not crowding her space, letting her decide how close she wanted this to get. "What are you reading?" "Nothing. It's boring." She held it up anyway, a book about a girl who could talk to whales. And within 20 minutes I had her acting out both sides of a conversation between the girl and an orca, laughing so hard she nearly fell off the step. I want to tell you honestly that I did understand, even then, the value of a child's genuine affection in a house like that one. A child who loves you freely becomes a house that is difficult to remove you from. I understood the strategy of it immediately. But I also want to tell you, just as honestly, that what happened between Ari and me over the following months was never manufactured on my end in the way it was with her parents. I never had to perform patience with her. I never had to calculate what she needed and manufacture the correct response. She was 6, and lonely, and hungry for someone who remembered her fears and her favorite foods and the specific way she liked her hair braided before bed. And I simply gave her those things because giving them cost me nothing and made an otherwise cold house slightly warmer for both of us. I do not think loving a child strategically and loving her honestly are as separate as they sound. I think, in her case, I managed to do both at once, and I have never once felt guilty about that particular contradiction. Chapter 6. Crossing the line. It happened in my 4th month. On a night a hostile acquisition attempt kept Adrian in his office until 2 in the morning, tie long gone, 3 empty coffee cups on his desk, staring at a spreadsheet like it owed him money. "Go home, Sielle," he said, not looking up. "I don't think you should be alone right now." I said it softly and let something into my voice I'd been rationing for 4 months, not manufactured warmth exactly, but the precise appearance of it delivered at the one moment it would land hardest. He looked up. "Vivienne would have gone home 2 hours ago." "I'm not her," I said, and let the silence after that do the rest of the work. He didn't touch me that night. He put his head in his hands, and I put mine very lightly on the back of his neck, and he let me, and neither of us said a single word about what it meant. That was enough. Alphas like Adrian do not fall for grand gestures. They fall for the one hand that stays in the room after every other hand has already left it. It became a real thing slowly, the way water becomes ice, 1 degree at a time. Late nights became dinners. He stopped scheduling around Vivienne at all. Dinners became, in December, a hotel suite I will not describe beyond saying I was careful, deliberate, and let him believe every gentle thing that happened in it was the first time gentleness-like that had ever been offered to him without a price attached. It wasn't free. It was simply the most expensive thing I owned, priced well enough that he never once saw the invoice. He knew he was married. He knew I was his assistant. He knew in the plainest possible terms that what he was doing was wrong, and he did it anyway without a single excuse offered to either of us. I have never asked him to excuse it since. I don't need him to. I only ever needed him to keep choosing it. Chapter 7. Julian. I met Julian, Vivienne's older brother, at a family dinner I attended in the specific capacity of the assistant Adrian trusts enough to bring instead of leaving important documents unattended. A role I had, of course, quietly arranged to occupy. He was 32, loud in the easy, unbothered way of men who have never had to fight for anyone's approval, and he found me setting out place cards in the dining room and grinned like he'd discovered something. "So you're the one my sister keeps complaining about," he said, delighted rather than accusatory. "She says you're suspiciously perfect." I told her that's just called being good at your job, but she wasn't in the mood to hear it. "I try to be useful, mister. I'm sorry, I don't actually know your surname." "Don't worry about it. Julian's fine. Formalities have never suited me much, even at my own family's dinners." He picked up one of the place cards, read the careful, elegant handwriting, and raised an eyebrow. "You did the calligraphy, too. Adrian's a lucky man. My sister's own assistant can barely spell her own name most days." I laughed, softly, genuinely, because it was actually funny, and because Julian had a way of making a room feel lighter just by standing in it. He teased me all through dinner, about my terrifyingly organized desk, about surviving working for a man his sister called emotionally a filing cabinet, about the fact that I'd apparently once made Adrian laugh out loud in a board meeting, an event Julian informed me was basically documented as a natural disaster. He told me, too, about growing up the older brother in a house that had doted on Vivienne from the moment she was born, the quieter, less remarked-upon son who'd learned early to make himself liked through charm rather than compete for attention. He suspected he'd never fully win. I filed that detail away carefully, the way I filed away everything, and understood, even that first dinner, exactly which door in him would eventually open easiest. I didn't engineer that friendship the way I'd engineered Adrian's attention. I didn't need to. Julian was easy and warm and entirely without suspicion, and I understood, watching him make Ari shriek with laughter over dinner. Exactly how simple it would eventually be to become someone he reached for without ever once being asked to. Chapter 8, the guest suite. My apartment building had a structural fire in the unit below mine that spring. And while repairs were underway, Adrian insisted, quietly, the way he insisted on everything as a fact rather than a request, that I stay in the guest suite of his own house. Vivienne hated it immediately. She complained to Adrian daily, in front of staff, in front of Ari, in front of anyone who happened to be in the room. She made passive remarks about strays and charity cases. When that didn't move Adrian at all, she escalated quietly to the staff themselves, instructing the kitchen not to prepare food for me, telling the housekeeper not to include my laundry, telling the household accounts not to stock the pantry with anything I might use. I found out because the housekeeper, mortified, told me directly, wringing her hands, apologizing for something that wasn't remotely her fault. I didn't make a scene. I never make scenes. Scenes are amateur work, and amateur work gets noticed by the wrong people. It's all right, I told her gently. I'll buy my own groceries. Please don't worry about it. I did buy my own groceries every single day, cheerfully, without complaint, and I made absolutely certain that every single staff member in that house watched me do it. There is nothing more effective, in a house full of people who already like you, than letting them witness cruelty toward you that you never once name as cruelty yourself. The staff began within 2 weeks, quietly leaving small things outside my door. A plate here, a thermos there. Acts of kindness Vivienne had explicitly forbidden, offered anyway because the house had already decided on its own who deserved protecting. When Adrian finally learned what she'd been doing, I never told him directly. Ari mentioned it first, innocently, over dinner, asking why Mommy didn't want Sielle to eat with them. I watched something in his face close over completely, the specific expression of a man filing away one more reason the marriage no longer deserved defending. He confronted her that same night in a conversation loud enough that I heard fragments of it from the guest's suite 2 floors up. He is a guest in this house because his apartment burned, Adrian said, each word deliberate. You starved a guest in my house, Vivienne. Do you understand how that looks? Do you understand what it says about you, that you'd rather humiliate someone than simply be gracious for a few weeks? She said something back, too quiet for me to hear, and he answered, flat and final, I don't care whose house you grew up in. You will act like an adult under mine. It was, I understood later from the staff who'd overheard the rest of it, the first time in 6 years of marriage that he had ever raised his voice to her about anything that didn't involve money. Chapter 9, Ordinary Weeks. I don't want you to think it all happened in a rush. So let me slow down here, because I think this is the part that matters most, and the part most stories like mine rush past too quickly. Between the night Adrian's head stayed in his hands under my palm and the night Julian first sought me out on his own, there were simply weeks. Ordinary ones. Adrian started leaving his office door open whenever I was at my desk. An unlabeled permission neither of us discussed. And some nights he'd just talk. About the acquisition, about his own father dead 9 years and still somehow running half his expectations of himself. About a dog he'd had before boarding school took him away from home for good. I listened to every word of it the way I listened to everything. Completely, attentively, cataloging. There was a Tuesday when Julian texted me nothing but a photograph of a ridiculous hat he'd seen in a shop window, no caption, and I replied warmly enough to be believed and briefly enough not to seem eager. There was a Thursday when Ari fell asleep against my arm during a car ride home from a school event, and Adrian, watching from the front seat, went so quiet for the rest of the drive that I understood, without either of us saying anything, exactly what he was thinking. None of these were declarations. They were only weeks, dozens of them, stacked patiently on top of each other, each one small enough to be nothing on its own, until one day I looked up and understood that most of a year had passed, and I had become the quiet center of a house I hadn't been born into. Chapter 10, Getting Tired of Her. I want to give you a few of these directly, because I think it matters to see the moments the men around Vivienne stopped being gentle with her, instead of only the aftermath of it. The first happened over the phone in autumn, and I only know the wording because Adrian didn't lower his voice and I was 3 feet away, pretending to sort mail. Vivienne had called about a rescheduled anniversary dinner, the 3rd reschedule that season, and I heard him say, flat, I don't have it in me tonight. I'm tired of the calendar and I'm tired of fighting about the calendar, and there's nothing left over after both of those. A pause, her voice rising thin through the receiver, and then quieter, more final than anything he'd said to her in months. Stop keeping score. It isn't helping either of us. He hung up before she finished her sentence. The second was Julian, at a dinner I wasn't present for, though he told me himself, still faintly astonished at his own bluntness. Vivienne had cornered him afterward, asking why he'd started avoiding her calls, and he'd told her plainly, "Because I'm tired of watching you resent someone who's never once been cruel to you. I love you, but I'm not refereeing this anymore." The third was her own father, shortest of all, and it did the most damage precisely because of how little he wasted on it. At a family dinner, after she'd said something sharp enough in front of guests that the table went silent, he set down his glass and said only, "You're embarrassing yourself. Compose your face before dessert arrives," and turned back to his conversation as though he hadn't spoken at all. Chapter 11. Sebastian. I met Sebastian Laurent properly at a charity gala in the early summer, Adrian's oldest friend. Elegant in a way that read as effortless because it had been cultivated for 31 years. The kind of man who could walk into any room in the city and immediately know exactly which conversations mattered. He didn't approach me directly that first night. He watched, from across the room, the way a collector watches a piece he hasn't yet decided to bid on. It was only at the third event that summer, a dinner for one of Adrian's charitable foundations, that he finally crossed the room toward me. "You're the one who makes Adrian actually answer his phone on weekends," he said, amused, sliding into the seat beside mine. "I've been trying to achieve that for a decade. I think he simply likes his schedule organized, Mr. Laurent." "Sebastian, please. And I don't think that's it at all." He studied me for a long moment, the specific, unhurried attention of a man who reads rooms for a living. "I've spent 15 years learning exactly how this city's beautiful people perform for an audience. You don't perform anything. That's the strange part. You just exist very quietly in the middle of every room, and somehow every important person in it ends up orbiting you within the hour." I felt, for one brief, uncomfortable second, genuinely seen not through my innocence, which everyone else believed completely, but through the mechanism of it, the actual shape of what I did. I recovered instantly, let my eyes go wide and slightly embarrassed, murmured something about not knowing what he meant. He laughed, delighted, and let it go entirely. I want to be honest that Sebastian is the only one of the three who ever came close to seeing the actual architecture underneath me, and the only one who, having glimpsed it, decided it didn't matter enough to keep looking. Sebastian fell for me slowly, over an entire season of galas and dinners and quiet asides, and by the time he realized how much he'd come to want me, he had already decided consciously that whatever I was beneath the surface, he wanted the surface anyway, badly enough not to ask further questions. There were other evenings that season, small and accumulating. At an autumn benefit, he found me alone at the edge of a terrace, avoiding a conversation I had no interest in continuing, and simply stood beside me in companionable silence for 10 full minutes before saying anything at all. A rare gift, silence offered without needing to fill it. At a formal dinner in October, he intervened, smoothly and without being asked. When an elderly investor cornered me with questions clearly designed to expose whatever gaps he assumed a pretty assistant must have, redirecting the conversation so gracefully that the investor never even noticed he'd been managed. "You didn't need my help," Sebastian said afterward, amused, handing me a fresh glass of champagne. "I could see that. I did it anyway. I wanted an excuse to stand closer to you." It was, I think, the first time any of the three had told me so plainly that his interest had never actually required an excuse at all. Chapter 12. Julian finds out Julian discovered the affair in July, by accident, arriving at Adrian's office to drop off a birthday gift for Ari, and finding the door unlocked at an hour it shouldn't have been. He didn't see anything explicit. He saw enough, my hand in Adrian's, a closeness that had no professional explanation attached to it, and I watched his easy, warm face do something I hadn't expected from him, go completely, coldly still. He didn't say anything in front of me. He waited until I'd gone and confronted Adrian directly, loudly enough that I heard the shape of it through the door I hadn't quite managed to close behind me. "She's my sister, Adrian. I know what she is. Then end it. Whatever this is, end it before it destroys everything." Adrian didn't end it. Julian knew from that day forward exactly what I was to his sister's marriage, and I want to be honest that I expected reasonably for him to hate me for it. He didn't. He avoided me for almost a month, cold and clipped in a way that didn't suit him at all. And then, slowly, against what I imagine was his own better judgment, he started finding reasons to be near me again anyway. I understood, watching him fail to stay away, exactly what was happening to him. He told himself, I think, that he was protecting someone vulnerable from his increasingly cruel sister. He didn't yet understand that protectiveness and desire had already, quietly, become the same feeling in him. Julian knew the truth about me and chose to fall anyway, with his eyes fully open, and I have never once pretended that makes either of us look better than we are. There was one evening, near the end of that cold, avoidant month, when he finally broke the silence himself, showing up at my apartment unannounced, clearly having debated the decision the entire drive over, and saying nothing at all for a full minute after I opened the door. "I keep trying to hate you," he said finally quiet, almost bewildered by his own sentence. "I've been trying for weeks. I can't make it stick." I didn't answer that the way it deserved to be answered. I only stepped back from the doorway and let him in, and understood, watching him cross the threshold, that whatever resistance he'd built over the past month had already, quietly, finished collapsing before he ever knocked. Chapter 13. The greed Vivienne's jealousy, once it found a genuine target, expressed itself the only way she'd ever learned to express anything, through what other people were allowed to have. In August, Adrian had a jeweler send over a slim gold bracelet. A small thing, the kind of gift a man buys someone he's fond of rather than someone he's obligated to. Vivienne saw it on my wrist at a family lunch and went very still. "That's a lager piece," she said, naming the jeweler, voice climbing. "I asked you for something from that collection 2 years ago. You said it wasn't in the budget." "It wasn't," Adrian said, not looking up. "This was. So there's a budget for him and not for me?" "There's a budget for people I don't have to negotiate with over everything," he said, and the table went silent in the specific way tables go silent when someone has said something true and ugly on purpose. It happened again in September. Over a spa weekend, Julian took me on at a resort Vivienne had been begging to visit for 2 years. She found out through a photograph and called him within the hour, loud enough that I could hear both sides of it from across the room. "You've had that place on your list forever and you take him." "Vivienne," Julian's voice had gone tired the way it always did with her lately. "You want everything the second you see someone else enjoying it. That's not wanting the resort. That's wanting to win. I'm done doing this with you." I never once asked any of them for a single gift in this entire story. That was the whole architecture of it. Vivienne asked and negotiated and kept score and complained bitterly when the score ran against her, because she had spent her entire life being handed things automatically and had never learned any other way to want something. I only ever had to exist quietly nearby when the impulse to give arrived on its own. Chapter 14. The house happened in October, and it was the first time I watched Vivienne try to actively stop something instead of only resenting it afterward, which meant it was also the first time I watched her lose, publicly, in real time. Adrian bought a house 2 districts from the estate and put it under my name. Not a lease, not an arrangement, a deed with my name on it, the kind of purchase that reads in a family like his as a permanent declaration. Vivienne found out from the family's own attorney and called Adrian in a fury I hadn't heard from her before. "You bought him a house, under his own name. Do you understand what that looks like?" "I understand exactly what it looks like," Adrian said. "It looks like a man taking care of someone he intends to keep. I am supposed to be the one you, Vivienne." His voice had gone flat, the register he used only for her now. "Stop being greedy. You have more than most people will ever have in their lives, and you're standing here jealous of a house." She tried to interfere with the sale directly, a call to the attorney, an invented pretext about a title dispute, and the attorney, baffled, called Adrian's father to ask why his daughter-in-law was attempting to sabotage a private transaction that had nothing to do with her. Adrian's father called Vivienne himself. I never learned exactly what he said, only that whatever it was left her too shaken to speak to anyone for the rest of that day, and that she stopped calling the attorney after that entirely. She didn't stop trying, only changed targets. She showed up at the property itself the following week, while the movers were still carrying in furniture, and stood in the half-empty living room demanding to know how much it had cost, as though a number might somehow undo the deed already filed. When the foreman, embarrassed, refused to discuss the sale price with someone who wasn't the owner, she turned on me instead, the first time she'd ever cornered me entirely alone. "You must be so proud of yourself," she said, low, venomous. "A house, an actual house with your name on the papers, and you didn't even have to marry anyone for it. Do you know how many years I spent earning the right to a house like this? You spent a year on your back and got one for free." I said nothing. I only looked at her with the wide, wounded eyes I have always known exactly how to produce, and let her see, in my silence, precisely the picture of an innocent person absorbing an unprovoked cruelty, which was, of course, exactly what the two movers standing awkwardly nearby saw as well, and exactly what they would go on to describe, unprompted, to anyone who later asked what kind of woman Vivienne Vale actually was. Chapter 15. Suspicion, tolerance, affection. Vivienne's family did not turn against her overnight, and I want to be honest about how slowly and how naturally it actually happened, because I think the speed of it is part of what made it so devastating for her. Her parents were suspicious of me at first, understandably, a beautiful young assistant, a marriage visibly fraying, all the obvious shapes of a story they assumed they already understood. I didn't argue with their suspicion. I simply continued existing, patiently, competently, kindly, in every room they happened to observe me in, helping an aunt find a lost earring at a garden party, remembering a cousin's dietary restriction before the caterer did, sitting with Vivienne's own grandmother for an hour at a family gathering nobody else had the patience for. Tolerance came first, grudging and small. Then, slowly, appreciation, a text from Vivienne's mother thanking me for noticing her migraine before anyone else had. Then affection, then something closer to genuine attachment, until by the following spring, several members of Vivienne's own family had begun, quietly, gently, defending me in conversations I never heard directly. This devastated her more than almost anything else that happened. Her own blood, choosing the man she'd decided had stolen her life, not because I asked them to, but because I had simply been present, and useful, and gentle, in all the specific ways she had stopped bothering to be with them years before I ever arrived. Vivienne's grandmother, in particular, became someone I visited on my own, entirely outside of any family obligation, simply because the old woman was lonely and sharp-tongued and delighted, in a way no one else in that family seemed to notice, by having someone patient enough to sit through her long, repetitive stories twice over without complaint. When she passed away the following winter, it was my hand she reached for in her final hours, not her own granddaughter's, and I don't think Vivienne ever fully recovered from learning that detail secondhand, after the fact, from a nurse who assumed she already knew. Chapter 16. The group chat. Vivienne's collapse accelerated in November, and it accelerated because of her own hand, the way it always did. She unloaded into a group chat with 4 old friends, calling me a whore, a gold-digging leech, a homewrecker, in messages sent fast and unfiltered at 1 in the morning with no one left in the room to stop her. She assumed, the way she assumed everything, that her friends were entirely on her side. One of them wasn't, not fully, not anymore, a woman who had grown quietly closer to Julian over the years than to Vivienne herself. The screenshots reached him within the week. He didn't confront his sister about it directly. He simply stopped answering her calls, and when their father asked why, he handed him his phone and said only, "Read it, then ask me again." The screenshots didn't stay contained to family. They reached, eventually, a small gossip account, then a larger one, and within days the messages were everywhere, dissected by strangers who had never met either of us and had, by then, no doubt at all about which one of us to believe. One phrase in particular spread faster than the rest, a line where she'd called me verbatim, "A pretty little parasite who doesn't even have the decency to be subtle about it." And I remember the specific, cold amusement of watching that exact sentence turned into captions under photographs of me at the office, at galas, at Ari's school recital, each one reframing the accusation as evidence of precisely the opposite, a person who had never once needed to be subtle because he had never once had anything to hide. Vivienne's response made everything worse. She doubled down. She claimed the screenshots were fabricated. She posted long, tearful explanations that convinced no one and enraged everyone further. She could not stop herself, and every attempt she made to defend herself only handed the watching public one more piece of evidence for exactly the woman they'd already decided she was. Chapter 17. The office. The affair ended the marriage on an ordinary Tuesday in December, and I want to describe it exactly as it happened, because it was the single moment that made everything else in this story irreversible. I was in Adrian's office, wearing one of his shirts. Mine had been ruined by coffee earlier that afternoon, and his was simply what was available, sitting sideways across his lap, giggling softly at something he'd whispered against my neck, his arm loose and warm around my waist. There was no ambiguity in the picture. There was nothing left to misread. The door opened without a knock. Vivienne froze in the doorway, and I watched her face do something I have never seen a face do before or since, an entire understanding arriving all at once, with nowhere left to retreat to. "You dirty home-wrecking whore," she said, and crossed the room before either of us could move and slapped me hard across the face. I scrambled backward off Adrian's lap, both hands rising to my own cheek, and the tears came fast and trembling and entirely convincing. Because some of them were real, the slap genuinely hurt. And some of them were the specific, practiced shape of devastation I have always known exactly how to produce. I looked, I am certain, exactly like the most wronged person who had ever stood in that room. Adrian was on his feet immediately, pulling me behind him. "Get out," he said, flat, final. "Security now?" She screamed something further, lunged at me again, and was physically removed from the executive floor in front of every assistant and passing director on that hallway, still shouting, her voice getting smaller as the elevator doors closed on it. Adrian held my face in both hands afterward, checking the mark left on my cheek with a tenderness that had nothing performed in it on his end at all. That night, he told me, for the first time, that he wanted the marriage over. Truly over. Immediately. Vivienne refused to cooperate. The divorce, once filed, dragged on for the better part of a year, contested at every possible turn, because she could not, even then, accept that the life she believed was permanently hers had already ended. Chapter 18. Ari after Ari did not understand the affair the way the adults around her understood it, and I want to be careful never to pretend otherwise. What she understood was smaller, and in its own way, far more absolute. Her mother had hurt someone Ari loved, in front of her own eyes at a family gathering weeks later where Vivienne, drunk on wine and grievance, had said something cruel enough about me that Ari had actually started crying at the table. "Why is Mommy so mean to Sielle?" she asked me that night, small and confused, sitting on the edge of my bed while I braided her hair for the morning. "He didn't do anything." I didn't answer that the way an honest person might have. I said only gently, "Grown-up things are complicated, sweetheart. It isn't your job to fix them." She accepted that, the way children accept most things adults refuse to explain, but something in her shifted after that evening regardless. She began, without any prompting from me, positioning herself physically between her mother and me, whenever Vivienne's temper rose in a room, small and fierce. A 6-year-old body doing what none of the adults around her seemed able to. It broke something further in Vivienne, watching her own daughter choose, instinctively, to defend the man she decided was her enemy. I never once asked Ari to do that. I only never gave her a single reason not to. Chapter 19. The Backlash. Vivienne's response to the leaked group chat should have been silence. Silence, at that point, would have been the only thing that might have slowed the bleeding. Instead, true to everything I had already learned about her, she made it catastrophically worse. She posted a long, tearful video the following day, insisting the screenshots had been doctored, that she'd never written those words, that I had somehow orchestrated the entire leak to destroy her reputation. It fooled no one who had actually read the messages, and it enraged everyone who had, because in trying to defend herself, she'd only drawn a much larger audience to the very words she was denying having written. She called 2 of the women in the original chat, demanding they publicly back her version of events. One refused outright. The other, cornered, admitted on her own account that the messages were real, that she'd simply been too afraid of Vivienne's temper to say so sooner. That confession alone did more damage than the original leak had. Vivienne tried once more. A second video, angrier this time, naming me directly, calling me things she hadn't dared call me publicly before. And that video, more than any other piece of evidence in this entire story, became the one clip strangers replayed most, because by then there was no ambiguity left in it at all. She had simply on camera in her own voice, proven every accusation true. Chapter 20. Julian's confession. Julian confessed in the middle of all of it, in January, on an ordinary evening at his own apartment, over the same terrible jokes and easy company that had drawn me to him in the first place. "I know exactly what this makes me," he said, not quite looking at me, turning a glass of wine slowly in his hand. "I know you're with Adrian. I know my sister hates you, and I know why, and I know none of that should matter to whatever this is that I keep feeling every time you walk into a room. But it does. I like you, Sielle. I've liked you for months, and I'm tired of pretending it's something safer than it is." I recognized his feelings before he ever said them, the way I recognize almost everything before it's spoken aloud. I acted surprised anyway, a soft intake of breath, a widening of my eyes, the picture of an innocent person encountering an unexpected confession for the very first time. I did not actively plot to take Vivienne's brother from her. I want that understood plainly. I simply understood, hearing him say it, that he liked me too, and that there was no reasonable version of my life in which I would refuse a second powerful man's devotion out of some sentimental loyalty to a woman who had never once been kind to me. I let his attachment deepen from there, the same slow, patient way I let everything deepen. By spring, Julian had become the second name in an arrangement none of us yet had a word for. Chapter 21. The restaurant The Public Unraveling had an early rehearsal months before the group chat, at a restaurant near the Vale Group Tower where Adrian and I had gone for what was meant to be an unremarkable dinner. Vivienne was there with 2 friends, and she saw us before we saw her. She didn't approach quietly. She crossed half the restaurant, loud enough that conversation at 3 separate tables actually stopped, and said, in a voice pitched to Carrie, "Taking your little assistant out to dinner now. Does he do tricks yet, or is warming your bed the only trick he knows?" The restaurant went silent in the specific, awful way rooms go silent when someone has humiliated themselves in front of strangers who owe them nothing. Adrian stood calm and said only, "Sit down, Vivienne, or I'll have you removed," in a voice that carried just as far as hers had. She didn't sit down. She kept going, something about gold diggers, something about how everyone in this city would soon know exactly what kind of Omega I was, until the restaurant's manager, mortified, personally asked her to leave, and she was walked out past a room full of strangers already quietly filming her on their phones. I said nothing the entire time. I didn't need to. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, eyes down, the picture of an Omega enduring a humiliation he hadn't provoked, while 3 different phones caught the exact same picture from 3 different angles. Vivienne shouting, red-faced, and me, silent, small, untouched by a single word of it. By the following morning, one of those videos had already reached a gossip account with a following in the tens of thousands. It was, I understood watching it spread, only a preview of what her own hand would eventually finish for her. Chapter 22. Her family splits by spring. Vivienne understood, in the plainest terms available to her, that her own family had begun quietly choosing me, and she responded the only way she knew how, by demanding that everyone around her pick a side out loud. She cornered Julian at their parents' house and told him, in front of their mother, that he had to choose his sister or the man who had destroyed her marriage. "You can't have both," she said. "I need you to say it. Say you're on my side." Julian didn't answer the way she wanted. "I love you," he said, quiet, careful. "I will always love you. But I'm not going to lie and say Sielle did something to you that you didn't do to yourself first. I've watched you for a year, Vivienne. I've watched every single thing that happened, and I can't keep pretending I don't see it just because you're my sister." She turned to their mother next, expecting an ally, and found instead a woman who simply said, tired, "I love you too, sweetheart, but I've watched the same year he has." Vivienne left the house that afternoon, and I'm told she didn't speak to either of them again for nearly 2 months. A self-imposed exile that only widened the distance she was trying, uselessly, to force everyone else to close. Chapter 23. The pregnancy I found out I was carrying in February, 5 months before the divorce would finally, mercifully conclude. I sat in my car in a clinic parking garage for 11 full minutes before I could make myself feel anything at all, and what arrived, when it finally did, surprised me. It wasn't calculation. For 11 minutes I was only a person who was pregnant, nothing more complicated than that. The calculation returned, of course. It always does. I told Adrian that night in the house that legally belonged to me. He went very still, then very careful, then did something I hadn't fully planned for. He cried quietly and said he'd never imagined anyone would want this, a family, a real one with him, and not merely the appearance of it. The twins were confirmed 6 weeks later. A son, a daughter. Adrian's possessiveness, already considerable, became something closer to a fortress after that. Within a week, he had personally vetted 3 separate obstetricians before choosing the one with the best reputation in the country, regardless of cost or convenience. He doubled the household security without telling me, until I noticed a second unfamiliar car in the driveway and asked. And he simply said, "It's already done," in the tone of a man who considered the matter closed before it had been opened. He memorized my prenatal schedule more thoroughly than his own board calendar, and more than once I found him standing in the doorway of the half-finished nursery late at night, simply looking at it, as though he still didn't quite believe it was real. His entire mentality had narrowed to a single sentence, repeated to anyone who questioned any of it. Nothing happens to him. Julian's response was gentler, and in its own way just as thorough. He started arriving with absurd, specific foods the moment I mentioned a craving, once driving 40 minutes across the city at 11 at night for a particular brand of pickled plums I'd mentioned once, in passing, weeks earlier. Sebastian's response was quieter still, expressed mostly through the careful, deliberate way he began introducing me. For the first time at social events, not as Adrian's assistant or Adrian's companion, but simply as Sielle, who is carrying the next generation of this family. A framing that shifted, almost overnight, how an entire tier of society understood my place among them. Ari was predictably thrilled beyond measure. She began calling the twins her little brother and little sister before anyone had confirmed which was which, planning a nursery in crayon, asking daily whether she could feel them kick yet, pressing her ear flat against my stomach at every opportunity and reporting, with complete seriousness, that she could hear them talking. Her attachment to me, already deep, only widened further to include two people who didn't yet exist outside of my own body. Vivienne learned of the pregnancy secondhand, through a cousin's careless mention at a family gathering she'd barely been invited to anymore. And I understand, from more than one source, that it was the specific moment she finally stopped believing the marriage could ever be salvaged in any form at all. Chapter 24. Sebastian's place. Sebastian became the third, formally in the spring. At a quiet dinner he arranged specifically to say what he'd apparently been holding back since our very first real conversation. "I know what you are to Adrian," he said, unhurried, the way he said everything. "I know about Julian, too. By now, this city doesn't keep secrets well, and I make it my business to know things before other people do. I should, by every rule I actually believe in, walk away from whatever this is." He paused, studied me with that same unhurried collector's attention. "I find that I don't want to. I've watched you for a year, Sielle, and whatever you actually are beneath all that softness, I want to be near it anyway. I'm asking you to let me." I let him. I want to be honest that some part of me admired him for saying it so plainly. Without the fumbling confusion Julian's confession had carried, Sebastian knew exactly what he was choosing, and chose it with his eyes fully open, and I have never had to pretend otherwise with him since. By early summer, the four of us existed in a shape none of us had a template for, each man arriving at his own attachment independently, each of them slowly, uncomfortably reconciling jealousy and history and the strange, tangled loyalties of a household that had once belonged, on paper, to someone else entirely. Chapter 25. The four of us. I don't want to give the impression that three powerful men simply folded into a single arrangement without friction, because they didn't, and I think the friction is worth describing honestly. Adrian's jealousy was the hardest to manage in the early months, because Adrian had never in his life been asked to share anything he considered his. He was short with Julian for weeks after the two of us became close, curt in meetings, needlessly critical of decisions that had nothing to do with any of it. It was Julian, in the end, who forced the actual conversation, cornering Adrian in his own office and saying, plainly, "You can resent me forever, or you can admit that he chose to let both of us in, and neither of us gets to punish him for the other one existing." Adrian didn't apologize. Adrian has never once, in the entire time I've known him, apologized for anything directly. But he stopped being curt with Julian within the month, and I understood that to be, in his own particular language, the same thing. Sebastian's arrival caused a different kind of friction. Not jealousy exactly, since Sebastian had never competed for anything in his life, but a quiet, careful renegotiation of space. Three men learning slowly which hours belonged to whom, which decisions required all three voices and which required only one. There were arguments, low and controlled, conducted mostly behind closed doors, so Ari would never have to hear them. There were nights one or another of them slept in a guest room rather than beside me, working through some private resentment I was rarely asked to referee. I let them work it out largely on their own. I want to be honest that I found the process, at times, mildly amusing to observe. Three formidable men, each accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted, slowly discovering that the only way to keep me was to stop competing over me and start, instead, coordinating. By the time Ari's 6th birthday arrived that spring, the four of us moved through a room together with an ease that had taken the better part of a year to build. And not one of them, by then, would have traded the arrangement for the simpler, lonelier version of wanting me entirely to himself. Chapter 26. The staircase. The incident that ended everything happened in July. At a large charity gala Adrian's family hosted every summer, over 300 guests. Security stationed at every entrance. The first major public event the four of us had attended together as a recognized, if not yet formalized, arrangement. I remember the earlier part of that evening with a strange, vivid clarity, the way people remember the last ordinary hour before something breaks. Ari had insisted on helping me choose my dress that afternoon, solemnly declaring pale blue the correct color, because it matches the baby's, and had cried happy tears when I let her pin a small silk flower into my hair to match her own. Adrian had held my hand through the entire receiving line, his thumb moving in slow, absent circles against my knuckles, a habit he'd developed sometime during the pregnancy that I don't think he was even aware of anymore. Julian had made me laugh so hard during the first course that I'd had to excuse myself briefly, and Sebastian had spent the better part of an hour quietly, expertly steering conversation away from anyone whose questions might have tired me. It was, I remember thinking at the time, one of the easiest evenings I'd had in months. I was 7 months pregnant, moving carefully, one hand at the small of my back. Vivienne had not been invited. She came anyway, through a service entrance, and found me alone near the east staircase, where I'd stepped out for air away from the crowd. Her hair had come loose from its pins. Her composure had burned all the way down to nothing. "Look at you," she said, voice ragged, none of its old polish left in it at all. "Standing there glowing like you actually won something. You're a whole 3 men decided to pour a family into. The second you're not useful, they'll throw you out exactly like they're throwing me out right now." "Mrs. Vale, please." "Don't," the word tore out of her. And then, before I could take a single step back, she shoved me, both hands flat against my chest, with the full, uncoordinated force of a year of watching her entire life dismantled by someone who had never once had to raise his voice to do it. I fell the entire flight. I want to describe this plainly without softening it. There was no controlled slide, nothing gentle in it at all. My temple struck the edge of the marble balustrade halfway down. I screamed on the way, a sound loud enough that I heard, even through the shock of falling, 300 conversations stop at once. And the sound of my body finally landing was, I'm told, audible clear across the ballroom. There was blood, a great deal of it, bright against pale stone from the gash at my temple, and more besides, low, frightening, unmistakably tied to the pregnancy, soaking through the pale fabric of my dress before anyone had even reached me. The pain in my side was sharp enough that for several seconds I genuinely could not make myself breathe. The ballroom emptied onto that staircase within seconds. Someone was already screaming for a doctor before I'd stopped moving. Guests I'd never spoken to in my life were suddenly kneeling on the marble beside me. One woman stripping off her own silk wrap and pressing it uselessly against my temple. Another shouting toward the entrance for someone, anyone, to bring towels, ice, anything at all. I remember the strange, distant clarity of hearing a man's voice somewhere above me say, "She pushed him, I saw it, she pushed him down the stairs." And another voice, a woman's, horrified, answering, "Is he the baby, is the baby?" Before the words dissolved into a general, rising din of shock. Adrian reached me first, his hands shaking so badly he could barely check the wound at my temple before Julian arrived seconds behind him, already on the phone with the hospital, and Sebastian close after, pale, silent, gripping my hand like he could hold me together through sheer force of will. Chapter 27. Her father, Vivienne's father, arrived on the landing perhaps 90 seconds after the fall, drawn by the same screaming that had emptied the ballroom, and found his daughter standing frozen at the top of the stairs, both hands pressed over her mouth, while below her a pregnant man lay bleeding on marble in front of 300 witnesses. What happened next happened in full view of every single one of them, with no privacy left to soften it. Vivienne's father crossed the landing and slapped her, once, hard enough that the sound of it carried nearly as far as my own fall had. "You could have killed him," he said, voice breaking on the word killed. "You could have killed my grandchildren." He did not wait for an answer. He turned immediately to help carry me toward the car, leaving his daughter standing alone on that landing in front of everyone she had ever known. She tried even then to deny it. "He fell. I never touched him. Someone help me. Nobody believes me." But at least a dozen guests had already seen the shove itself, and every phone in that ballroom that hadn't already been recording was recording within the minute. No one in that crowd, not one single person, looked inclined to believe a word out of her mouth. I want to tell you what I understand of what happened on that landing after the car pulled away, because I wasn't conscious for all of it, but Julian told me later, quietly, on a night neither of us could sleep. Vivienne's mother arrived moments after her husband's hand had already fallen, and rather than comfort her daughter, stood frozen at the top of the stairs looking down at the blood on the marble, and said only to no one, "What did you do?" Not a question. A verdict delivered by the one person in that family who had defended Vivienne longest and most patiently, finally, visibly, running out of anything left to defend. Vivienne stood alone on that landing for nearly 10 minutes before anyone thought to walk her away from the guests still staring. And by the time someone finally did, the story had already finished writing itself in front of 300 witnesses who would tell it, in their own words, to everyone they knew before the week was out. Chapter 28, The Hospital. I was fine. The twins were fine, a fact confirmed after the longest hour of my entire life, while 3 men who loved me paced a hospital corridor and would not sit down. I remember fragments of the ride there more clearly than I remember the fall itself. Julian's voice, tight and controlled in a way I'd never once heard from him, telling the driver to run every light between the estate and the hospital. Adrian's hand, wrapped so tightly around mine that I could feel his pulse hammering through it, saying nothing at all, because there was nothing left in him at that moment except the single, narrowed thought that I was still breathing. Sebastian in the front seat, on the phone with the hospital's chief of obstetrics, a man he apparently knew personally, securing a private room and a specialist team before we'd even arrived. His voice the only steady one in the entire car. I needed 11 stitches at my temple and careful monitoring for the bleeding that followed. And the doctor said, more than once, gently, that a few inches either direction and the story would have ended very differently for all 3 of us. I watched that sentence land on each of the 3 men in the waiting room like a physical blow. Adrian did not leave my bedside for 11 straight hours. Julian sat on the floor outside the door for the first 2, unable to make himself walk back in until he was certain from the nurse's passing that I was actually stable. Sebastian, when he finally allowed himself to cry, did it quietly, turned toward the window, as though even his grief needed to be composed for an audience that wasn't there. Ari was kept away that first night, too young, everyone agreed, for the sight of me in a hospital bed. And I'm told she cried for an hour when Adrian finally explained why she couldn't come, insisting, over and over, that she needed to see for herself that I was really all right. She was allowed in the following morning and climbed carefully onto the edge of my bed and pressed her small hand flat against my stomach where the twins were, and said, with the complete conviction of a 6-year-old, "You're not allowed to get hurt again." I decided, Chapter 29, what the cameras showed. I didn't need to leak anything. The estate's own event security had cameras covering that staircase, standard for a gathering that size, and within 48 hours a clip of the entire incident had made its way onto the internet, first a small forum, then everywhere. I never learned who leaked it, and for once I mean that literally. It didn't matter who. The footage needed no narration. It showed, in flat, undeniable color, Vivienne's hands on my chest, the shove, the fall, the blood, and her own father's hand crossing her face in the same unbroken shot. The group chat screenshots resurfaced beside it. The old public tantrums resurfaced too. Within a week there was no one left in Vivienne's life who hadn't already, privately, made their choice. Her mother's old friends stopped returning calls. Her own school friends went silent. Her family, who had spent a year slowly, naturally choosing me instead of her, simply stopped defending her at all. She left the country within the month, and I heard secondhand that she is somewhere far from all of this now, trying to build a life that isn't shaped entirely by what she lost. I hope that's true. I want to be honest, one final time, about the strangest part of this entire story. I never once had to lie to get here. Not about anything that mattered. Vivienne did the rest of it herself, every single time, and all I ever had to do was exist quietly nearby and let a world already inclined to believe the worst of her watch her prove it true. Chapter 30, the divorce finalized in September, 2 months after the staircase, and the formal bonding ceremony followed quietly in November. No wedding theater, no grand announcement, only paperwork drawn with unusual care and 4 names on it. Mine, Adrian's, Julian's, Sebastian's, each of them legally and permanently tied to me, and to the children by then only weeks from being born. We held it in the garden of the house that already belonged to me. No photographers beyond the family's own. No guest list beyond the people whose lives had actually reorganized themselves around mine over the past 2 years. Adrian's mother, initially the coldest toward me of anyone in that family, cried harder than anyone during the vows, and afterward pressed my hand between both of hers and said only, "I'm glad it was you in the end," which I understood, from a woman who rarely said anything she didn't fully mean, as the largest compliment she was capable of giving. Julian gave a toast so unabashedly sentimental that Sebastian had to physically take the microphone from him before he made himself cry in front of the caterers. Sebastian's own words were quieter, characteristically composed, and somehow landed harder for it, I have spent my entire life reading rooms for a living. I have never once in 32 years wanted to stop reading a room and simply stay in it. Sielle is the only room I have ever wanted to stay in. Ari stood beside me through the entire signing, holding my hand, glowing with the specific joy of a child who has finally got to keep someone. I have now everything I once understood I would spend my whole life going without. A beautiful home I own outright, 3 powerful men who compete gently to notice what I need before I ask, a daughter who chose me as thoroughly as I ever chose her, and a family whose loyalty I never once had to force out of anyone. Chapter 31. What I never said out loud. The twins were born in December. A boy with Adrian's serious eyes, and a girl with what everyone insists is my own quiet, watchful expression. I held them both for the first time in a room full of soft light, and 3 men crying without any embarrassment at all. And Ari pressed close against my side, already narrating to her new siblings everything they had missed. I felt something in that moment I have felt only a handful of times in my entire life, something that wasn't strategy, or performance, or the long architecture of getting somewhere safe. I don't know what to call it precisely. I'm not certain it's love, the way songs mean the word. I think it might simply be relief, permanent this time, after 22 years of never once being sure I got to stay anywhere. That night, once the house had gone quiet, I sat alone with my children asleep against me, and let myself think the one thing I have never said aloud to a single person in this account. I never fell in love with any of them. Not the way they believe I did. Adrian, Julian, Sebastian, each of them is certain in his own private way that he was the one who finally reached something real underneath all my softness. None of them did. What they reached, and what they've spent 2 years defending with everything they have, is a life I built entirely on my own terms, out of nothing but patience, timing, and the specific, unglamorous skill of making myself impossible to live without. I think, if I'm honest about the whole of it, that this is the part people will find hardest to forgive me for, not the affair, not the calculation, but the fact that I never once needed any of it the way I let them believe I did. I was never the fragile thing they thought they were protecting. I was only ever the one holding the pen, quietly, the whole time, while 3 of the most powerful men in this city convinced themselves they were the ones writing the story. They think they won me? They never once realized I was the one who chose them, carefully, in the exact order that suited me, and let each of them believe the choosing had gone the other way. I don't feel guilty about any of it. I feel simply, finally, secure, the particular stillness of someone who spent every year of his life braced for the ground to move, discovering, at last, a floor with no intention of doing so. I looked down at my children's faces in the dark and smiled the real smile, the one I don't perform for anyone, because there was no one awake left to perform it for. Ari found me there an hour later, unable to sleep herself, and climbed quietly into the chair beside mine without a word, resting her head against my arm the way she'd done since she was 6 years old and still uncertain whether I was going to stay. I am the only mother she has ever truly known how to reach for, and I understood, sitting there in the dark with all 3 of my children finally under one roof, that whatever I am beneath the softness the rest of the world sees, I have never once, not for a single day, given her a reason to doubt that she was safe with me. That, I think, is the one part of this entire story I would defend without any performance at all, if anyone ever thought to ask me for a defense. I never once had to lie to become what I am to this family. I only ever had to be patient, and useful, and quietly, permanently impossible to remove. And by the time anyone thought to question how thoroughly I'd secured my place among them, there was no longer anyone left in the room who wanted me gone. The end.